In the 9th century, Askold, the legendary ruler of Kiev, crossed the Black Sea with his troops, leading the first Rus attack on Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. 1,000 years later, the name Askold was heard again on the seas. It was given to a first-rank protected cruiser of the Imperial Russian Navy, a hero of 2 wars, and the favorite ship of the Emperor of Russia, Nicholas II.
At the end of the 19th century, the Russian Empire was preparing for an inevitable confrontation with Japan. In 1897, a special program of accelerated shipbuilding for the needs of the Russian Far East was adopted. Within this program, the Naval Command drew up technical requirements for a first-rank cruiser that would carry out long-range reconnaissance for a squadron. It was to be faster and more powerful than British and Japanese cruisers. Germany's shipyard, owned by the famous Krupp Company, was one of the winners of the International Projects contest. Work began on October 24, 1898, as soon as Krupp plants delivered the first shipment of metal, even before the design documentation got the final approval. 2 months later, the cruiser was named Askold. Length 131.2 meters, beam 16.9 meters, draft 6.2 meters, total displacement by project 6,000 tons. The long and narrow hull of the cruiser with destroyer-like proportions had excellent seagoing capability and a power plant producing 23,500 horsepower, which allowed her to develop a maximum speed of 24 knots. The best nickel steel in the world, produced by Krupp factories, was used to build the cruiser. The armored turtle deck, the main protection element, was from 40 to 100 millimeters thick. The conning tower was armored with 150 millimeter plates. The cruiser's artillery was quite powerful for her displacement. When Askold was commissioned, she had 12 152mm and 12 75mm Cannet guns on board. Apart from that, she carried another 13 small caliber cannons and 2 machine guns. Traditionally for the time, 6 torpedo tubes were installed in the Askold's hull. They had no real combat value, and most of them were removed during repairs after the Russo-Japanese War. During construction, the cruiser's project continued to be modified according to the demands of the Russian Navy. For example, the location of the forecastle gun was changed to increase the seagoing capabilities. However, shipbuilders firmly refused to reduce the number of smokestacks, fearing that it would impair the speed. That's how the cruiser received her unique 5-stack silhouette. After Askold's sea trials, Nikolai Rietzenstein, the head of the inspection board and the first captain of the ship, wrote in his report, "The Navy receives the fastest cruiser in the world." On January 12, 1902, St. Andrew's flag, jack, and pennant were raised on the ship during a solemn ceremony. Soon after that, she sailed to Kronstadt, where the brand new cruiser was honored twice with a visit from Emperor Nicholas II. She then faced a serious trial in the form of a 6-month cruise across 3 oceans to the Russian Far East. Askold accomplished it with ease and showed the impeccable reliability and high efficiency of all ship systems. In February 1903, the cruiser arrived at Port Arthur and joined the Pacific Squadron. The Russo-Japanese War was less than a year away. In the evening of January 26, 1904, Askold was the closest to the Japanese destroyers that staged a surprise attack on Russian ships in Port Arthur's harbor. But thanks to her well-trained crew, she managed to avoid any damage. The next morning, Askold, together with other cruisers, daringly attacked the main forces of the Japanese fleet that approached Port Arthur in an attempt to draw the enemy's attention and give the Russian ironclads a chance to form the battle line. Several months of intense combat service later, Askold had her moment of glory. On July 28, the Russian squadron exited the harbor to try to break through the Vladivostok. Askold led the line ahead of the cruiser squadron under the broad pennant of her former captain, now Rear Admiral Nikolai Rietzenstein. During the day, the main forces of the Japanese and Russian fleets clashed in a firefight twice. At 18:30, the critical moment of the battle came. The Russian flagship lost control, and the remaining ironclads turned back towards Port Arthur. By that time, the broken formation of Russian ships was surrounded by 45 enemy ships. Then Admiral Reitzenstein, on the Askold's battle bridge, decided to lead a breakthrough, drawing the enemy fire and disregarding its own safety. The signal, "Cruisers follow me," rose on the foremast, smokestacks spewed black smoke, and Askold rushed towards the enemy.
Thanks to her speed, excellent maneuverability, and firing accuracy, the cruiser managed to survive under a hail of fire from the Japanese ships. Showered with shells, Askold led the battle from both sides. Her hull shook tremendously from each shell hit, but Askold steamed ahead at full speed, directly towards the Japanese ships that tried to turn and get out of the Russian cruiser's way.
The pursuit continued throughout the night. By the following morning, the last Japanese ships had fallen behind and disappeared beyond the horizon, having lost the battle against Askold's engines. However, the Russian cruiser paid a high price for her heroic breakthrough. Her hull had many breaches. Only 4 of the main guns remained operational, and 60 crewmen were killed or wounded. Without the ability to fight her way to Vladivostok, Askold had to be interned in the neutral Shanghai. After the war with Japan, and until 1914, Askold was the flagship of the Siberian flotilla and the biggest Russian warship in the Far East. The years during World War I became the most difficult and eventful in the entire service of the cruiser. She swept the Pacific Ocean in search of coal vessels that supplied the German ships of Admiral von Spee, escorted convoys with Australian troops in the Indian Ocean, bombarded German and Turkish coastal defenses in the Mediterranean, and participated in the famous Dardanelles campaign. And in all these theaters of war, Askold was the main or even the only representative of the Imperial Russian Navy. From August 1914 to December 1915, the cruiser's crew spent 294 days under general quarters, with crews manning guns. The ship fired twice as many shells than during her previous service, including the Russo-Japanese War, and all this without serious breakdowns and losses. However, the intense service took its toll. The elderly cruiser spent 1916 in Toulon, where she underwent a complete overhaul. In December 1916, Askold was assigned to the Arctic Ocean Flotilla. But on her way from Toulon, the cruiser was hit by a severe storm and required further repairs in England. It wasn't until 1917 that Askold entered the harbor of Murmansk, thus returning to Russia after crossing half the world and sailing thousands of miles. In her homeland, the cruiser was engulfed by the whirlwind of the Civil War. In 1920, Askold was seized by the British, and in 1922, she was repurchased by the Soviet government, but she was in bad shape and sold for scrap to Germany.
The famous Russian shipbuilder, Alexei Krylov, who had sailed aboard the ship on her first voyage to the Far East, witnessed the famous cruiser enter a dock in Hamburg, where she was scrapped, thus ending the service record of the ship that Russian sailors called Lucky.